Denise, should we start?
Yeah.
Okay. Everyone. Okay, perfect. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today, online and in person. It's my pleasure to welcome Professor Cynthia Sung today from the University of Pennsylvania. She's an associate professor in mechanical engineering and applied mechanics, and her work explores computational methods for robot co-design, particularly in origami-inspired and compliant robotics. And today she will be sharing her latest work titled Salp-Inspired Approach to Underwater Multi-Robot Locomotion. Yes, so without further ado, I'm very happy to hand over the screen to Professor Sung, and we're all happy to hear your talk today. Thank you very much for being here.
Great. Thank you very much for the invitation and for attending this talk. I'm really excited to share some of the work that we've been doing in soft and compliant robots, but also more recently in underwater locomotion. So to motivate some of the work that we've been working on, I want to start with this video, which perhaps some of you have seen, but for those of you who haven't, I guess Zoom is not a great way to get audience input, but any ideas on what this video is showing us? So when I show this video, oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying maybe there's a chance of getting people in the room to just use the owl to say things. Manuel, is it on? Or is just everyone quiet?
No, the owl is on, but we only have one spectator in the room and the rest is online.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Don't worry about it.
Oh.
I mean, people online should feel free to also jump in. And if you have questions throughout the talk, please also feel free to interject. I don't mind. But when I show this video, so I'll just keep going. When I show this video, a lot of times with no context, right? People say this is a black and white video of a fish, right? It's swimming upstream, hits this rock, gets thrown off course, and then restarts. But what I want to do now is show you the title of the paper that this video came from. And the title is Passive Propulsion in Vortex Wakes. This was a piece of work from 2016, where this is not just a fish that's swimming, this is actually a dead fish. And what's happening here is that this fish is being is attached by a string at its nose right here to a point over here on a fake rock. And there's a flow that's being generated in this environment. And the interaction between the flow and the robot's body is what is creating this oscillating motion that actually, with no active control and no actuation at all, allows this fish to swim forward. And so there are really fascinating questions here about how we can get efficient swimming, efficient underwater robotic locomotion by taking advantage of really good design. And so in the context of underwater robotics, there have been quite a few pieces of work, including those by people in this room, where people have looked at how we can create new mechanisms, new actuation strategies, new control strategies for getting robots to be able to move around in 3D in underwater environments. And you see a lot of these works are biologically inspired. A lot of them have soft components. A lot of them have really complicated actuation structures that allow them to create these sort of motions that mimic what we see in biological systems. At the same time, though, designing underwater systems is really challenging precisely because of the way that the robots need to interact with this fluidic environment to be able to do these sorts of tasks, not just succeed at doing these tasks, but succeed in doing them efficiently and agilely and in ways that we can actually use for real robotic tasks. So the premise behind the work that we do in our lab is really about this interaction between the robot and the environment. And in particular, we believe that robust and efficient task execution comes from the interaction between the two. And so generally, when we think about robotics, for example, in a more commercial or industrial context, you have the environment and you have the robot. And the way that we think about planning and design for these robots is, how do we get the robot to be able to do work on the environment? How do we get it to do pick and place tasks? How do we get it to navigate around obstacles, that sort of thing? But in a lot of locomotion tasks, actually, the environment also has a huge impact on the response from the robot itself. And this loop between the robot and the environment requires us to be able to logic about, is key to being able to design these sorts of systems. So we take a look at this loop. This is what we call embodied intelligence. And in particular, when we think about computational design or code design, or just how we approach trying to create these sorts of systems, we want to reason about how we manipulate those responses. So going back to this video then, the sorts of questions that we think about in our group are really about trying to manipulate this interaction. And so the questions that we think about are, well, what is the shape and morphology that is useful for this, for whatever sort of task it is that we care about? In the context of this fish, there is a particular shape that this fish has evolved into that allows it to be streamlined, to reduce drag, to be able to create these sorts of oscillating motions in its body. There are questions that have to do with what actuators we need to use, where those actuators are placed, how many are required in order to get the sort of motion that we care about, and what are the control strategies that are associated with the actuators and the higher level design that we're using in the system. So our lab has investigated these sorts of questions in the context of a lot of different platforms, usually looking at pairwise interactions between different between these bullets. So we've done some work in origami-inspired design, where now we can think about how we can embed electronics, actuation sensing directly into the robot body. But then there are really interesting questions about how the mechanics of the robot change when you embed those components in, and how that now affects what your actuation strategy might be. We've done some work in how we can co-design over the mechanics and the control of a robot. So what you're seeing in the bottom left is this legged platform, where we've been really interested in how we can tune the compliance of an origami structure and how that affects the robot's passive response to, in this case, a ladder-like environment. So we can do passive grasping as a robot might be jumping or running over this sort of terrain. We've been looking at questions in actuation and interaction between robots on complex environments. So this is a sandy environment that is supposed to be a simulant of the lunar terrain, where we have these two robots that are connected to each other and are attempting to use this this arm that is between the two to be able to affect to be able to apply forces to each other and help each other to be able to gain more traction or traverse this environment more effectively. And then in the context of underwater robots, which I wanted to focus mostly on today, we've been interested in the questions of, well, how do we design the connectivity between multi-robot systems and simultaneously think about control of the individual units and how they design their controllers relative to each other to be able to get effective locomotion. So a lot of really interesting questions in this space at the intersections between these different subcomponents. So I'm going to be focusing on this project today, our underwater system. Before I do that, though, I wanted to also introduce the project in a different way, because a lot of times when I present, students ask, oops, what is going on here? Sorry, my computer was spazzing out a bit. A lot of times when I present the work with this kind of story, students ask, well, you know, then where do these platforms come from? And how do we know that these are platforms that we want to use to be able to answer these questions? And honestly, the answer is that a lot of these sorts of projects come as a result of just through conversations and really spontaneous interactions with other researchers. So where we started a few years ago was not really in underwater robotics at all. Our group was originally a group that worked almost exclusively in origami-inspired design. And at the time, we had been thinking about how we could design more robust, larger scale origami structures as compared to a lot of the origami robots that existed, which were restricted to about the centimeter scale. So we did some work in origami mechanics where it turns out that actually, in order to tune the compliance of an origami structure, you can take advantage of ideas from computational geometry that tell you that for certain types of structures that you might want to fold, there is a requirement that there will be stress in this, or there will be strain in the faces of the origami pattern itself when you deform that pattern. There's a class of origami structures that are what we call rigidly foldable, where you don't have any deformation in the faces. And there's another class which are non-rigidly foldable, where that strain is required in order to deform. And so this is known as the Bellows theorem, where actually, if you have these enclosed polyhedral surfaces and you try to compress them, then no matter what you do, you cannot design a rigidly foldable structure. And it turns out that you can actually design and model these sorts of structures in order to change the force response when you apply that sort of deformation. So we had been exploring this idea in the context of legged robots, trying to see whether we could store and release energy into these robots with enough speed and enough power to be able to get kilogram scale running and jumping. But at the same time, then there was another group in Korea that was looking at a completely different pattern. This is the magic ball pattern, which is a tessellation of water bomb units. And they were designing, oh, let me, they were trying to design these transformable wheels to be able to also scale up origami design, in this case, for the purpose of designing this, this car. And we looked at this pattern and said, oh, well, this is actually also subject to the Bellows theorem, where you see that this is an enclosed polyhedral pattern. It's being compressed lengthwise to be able to get this wheel to grow and shrink. And that means that this pattern is also subject to these sorts of ideas of being able to store and release energy into the pattern itself. So one of the students in my lab became very interested in this pattern.
Cynthia, we lost your audio here. Can you double check?
Is that better?
Now we can hear you again.
Okay, sorry about that. Where did I get cut off?
Like 10 seconds.
Okay.
So just
So one of my students became very interested in this pattern and wanted to see whether we could model it, figure out where the strain is stored inside of this pattern, and then also use it for some kind of interesting task. And so what you're seeing here is us applying this bar and hinge model to the magic ball. And in the video that just played, this is a simulation of compressing the magic ball. The blue areas are the ones that have low strain, and the yellow areas are the ones that have high strain when you do this compression. And so basically, there's a lot of deformation in the ball around the equator, and then less so around the ends. And that translates to this force displacement curve that you see on the right. You can see the model as compared to data that we measured on an MTS machine that shows that as you compress the ball, then the resistance force increases. And so we can use basically the magic ball also as a spring. So they got very excited about this and said, well, let's see whether we can turn it into something interesting. And it turned out that what they were interested in creating was an underwater robot. So this is the magic ball that we had 4 years ago now, where they designed this tube that had a DC motor and a spool inside. The spool is connected to a tendon that exits the tube through this side, and then connects to an end cap that we attach to the other side of the magic ball. What you're seeing down here is the actuation structure. So we have this DC motor, this spool. This spool has teeth on it. And so by moving this spool out and in, you can engage or disengage the teeth. And what happens then is that when the teeth are engaged and the DC motor turns, then you can contract the magic ball. And then when you disengage the spool and release the teeth, then because of the natural mechanics of this magic ball, now it will passively return to its extended state and actually do that fairly quickly. What's also really interesting about this pattern is that during that process of compressing and expanding in length, the volume changes. And so now when you put this robot in the water, you can get this jet-propelled swimming. And so this was the first version of our underwater robot that we built, where we had this magic ball pattern that is made out of PET plastic. We laser cut the pattern by perforating where all the folds were, and then folded it by hand, attached it to this actuation mechanism. And you can see here that it's able to contract and then release very quickly to create this jet. This bar that you see at the top is just a radio that we were using to be able to stream the data back so that we could actually measure its performance. The robot is fully untethered and it's able to execute this sort of jetting motion on its own. And when we did this and we measured the velocity and the cost of transport of this robot, we were surprised because actually the cost of transport of this robot turned out to be very similar to squids of the same size. And so we were really excited about this and said, well, are there other interesting questions that we can start to answer in underwater propulsion? Of course, though, you may be looking at this robot and saying it's not a very good robot, because the use of the origami skin, it gives us this nice feature of being able to create this jet through the passive mechanics of the skin. But actually, this skin has a lot of divots in it, which increase drag. And so the very first thing we did while trying to enhance the system was basically get rid of the origami design. So even though this project started as an origami-inspired project, it no longer is. And so this is the new version of the robot, which we recently presented at RoboSoft, which is now this elastomeric skin with this with bending beams, but using the same actuation mechanism where we're basically spooling to be able to contract the robot in length, and then using the passive mechanics of the robot to be able to very quickly create this jet. Because the skin is smooth, we automatically get much higher velocities and a much lower cost of transport. So this is kind of the state of the robot right now. And at this point, now we're kind of in this space of underwater robots that I showed you at the beginning, where this is just another mechanism that you can use for swimming. And so the question is, what do we want to do with this system? And this is where conversations with people who are not necessarily robotics at all come into play. Because we showed this video to one of the colleagues in my department who actually just really likes surfing. And he said, this robot looks very much like a salp. So salps are these underwater jellies that are tubular. Their bodies are basically entirely soft, and they have a front and back aperture where they suck in water through the front, and they expel the water through the back. So the water flow looks like this. They have a membrane in the middle that they use to filter the water and to feed. And so basically this process of moving water through their body is used both for locomotion and for feeding. What you're seeing down here is a picture of salps on a person's hand, so you can get a sense of scale. These creatures are somewhere between 1 centimeter and 10 centimeters in length. And they're considered some of the world's most efficient jet-propelled organisms. So what you're seeing on the right here is a biology paper that looked at different animals that use jet propulsion as a locomotion mechanism. And we see that there are the squids, which are very popular in soft robotics. There are the jellyfish, which are also very popular, some bivalve in the middle, and then the salp. And if we compare the cost of transport and the speeds that are able to be achieved by these systems, the salp, compared to some of these other systems, has very, very low cost of transport. And so one of the questions is why. The only organism with data in this chart that has a lower cost of transport is the jellyfish. But if you look at the max speed, those velocities are very low. And so what we're trying to do in this project is see what is it about the Salp that allows them to get this combination of very low cost of transport and also decent locomotion velocities. Now, if you look at the picture here, you might see an interesting feature that's different from these other organisms on the chart, which we think, and also biologists think, is the key to getting to making salps such efficient swimmers. And that is that salps grow in colonies. And so actually, when you look at a salp as a jet-propelled swimmer, they can swim in the solitary mode, but they can also swim physically connected to each other. And actually, these colonies are the way that they reproduce. So when salps reproduce, they make copies of themselves attached physically to each other to create these really long salp chains that are up to hundreds of units long and swim as a group. Now, they are actually individual organisms with their own nervous systems. They have the ability to detach, and they do detach when they're trying to escape from a predator, for example. But when they are attached together, they exhibit these really interesting locomotion modes, which is that they jet, but they don't necessarily jet all in synchronicity. So I'm going to show you here another video of a salp chain. And I think there's some really interesting control insights that we can gain from just observing this video. One is that there's this really long chain, again, with a lot of units that are creating these jets. This chain is not a uniform chain. So one of the things that we think about in robotics is that we have these designs, they're symmetric, maybe we have lattice structures, and the lattice structure is what allows you to be able to be very, very optimal potentially in your design. But if you look at this chain that's in this video, there are units that are missing, and not all of the units are perfectly aligned with each other, and yet this chain still is able to move effectively. The other thing that you might notice from watching this video is that not all of the units are jetting. And so actually in these sorts of system, even though the whole system has 80 to 100 units, as few as 10% of them are jetting at a single time, which means that the rest of them are kind of just hanging out and along for the ride. And this allows the entire system potentially to lower its energetic cost. The third insight that I want you all to notice is that the ones that are jetting, that are active, are not all jetting at the same time. So there's this other very common mode of control in multi-robot systems, which is that we want everybody to synchronize, or we want them to reach consensus. And we think that figuring out how these robots can reach consensus will allow us to get some better performance or more interesting performance in a multi-robot system. But actually in these sorts of underwater systems, you don't want these, or I'll get to this part in a minute, but these biological systems don't all jet at the same time. And so these are interesting features of these sorts of biological systems that may tell us something about how we can manipulate the interaction between swimming units and the environment. And so I'm bringing back this slide here, which I had originally showed you for fish. But all these same questions apply to this sort of salp chain that I'm showing you now, where there's a question of shape and morphology, like how many units are actually required for this sort of system in order to be effective? Actuator placement, in this case, what are the physical arrangements of units that are connected together to create these sorts of chains? And in terms of control strategy, what is the level of coordination that is required? And if coordination is required, since it's not getting all of the units to synchronize, what is that coordination? These questions are, I think, much easier to explore in a modular system than in a fully integrated fish robot, in the sense that now we can really take these individual jetting robots, connect them to each other in different ways, and explore these questions without having to redesign the entire thing. And so this is how we started on this quest for understanding of multi-jet locomotion and the interaction between the robot and the fluid. I will also say that along the way, one of the interesting observations that we've had is that, as you might see on this slide, there's a very big there's a relationship between now work that's happening in multi-robot systems and work that might be happening in soft robotics, in the sense that I transitioned from fish to salps, but if you think about this salp as having a single control system, salp colony as having a single control system, it's basically like an eel-like structure, right? And so you have distributed actuators throughout this entire colony. How do we think about shape or design? How do we think about actuator placement and actuator design? These are questions that show up both in multi-robot systems, where there's been a long history of work, and in soft robotics, where I think we may not have thought about those questions so much, but we can learn from what people do in multi-robot systems to be able to make more efficient designs. So we want to explore these sorts of questions. We've been gaining a lot of inspiration from biologists. So it turns out that in the United States, at least, there is really only one salp biologist. Her name is Kelly Sutherland. She's been looking at these multi-jet systems for years and really trying to understand how the number of units, how the coordination between units, and how the morphology of units affects their motion. She takes field trips out to the Pacific Ocean to study these organisms, and she's found some trends in how these systems work. In particular, that when we look at these systems, we can think about either synchronous or we can think about synchronized or asynchronized jetting, and that when these systems are moving in the natural world, synchronized jetting allows them to get higher accelerations, higher velocities, while asynchronized jetting gives them higher energy efficiency. And these effects are magnified when you have more units. And so this was where we started our investigation, and we wanted to see how we could take the single robot now that we had already designed and look at how two of them might interact with each other. So we rebranded the project. It's called the Salp now. Salp stands for Salp-Inspired Approach to Low Energy Propulsion. And we're trying to see whether, when we have this two robot system, we can see similar effects in the coupled interaction between physical arrangement and jetting control. So this is the robot, two of them connected to each other, swimming underwater. What you're seeing on the right is an overhead view of the robot swimming in the tank that we have. This robot naturally floats, actually, and then so we have to weight the system down and then put it on a piece of foam just to make sure that it stays basically so that we don't have to deal with buoyancy control right now. And we can really just look at the effect of jetting. But the way that we're connecting these robots together is by putting this rigid attachment in the front. There's a collar here that we're using to attach the front of the two robots. And then through this collar, there's also a wire that connects the two robots electrically. Through that wire, these two robots can communicate with each other and set their phase offset. And so each of the robots is executing this cyclical motion of contracting, holding, and then releasing. And then this release component is the robot creating the jet. Now we have a leader robot, which is setting the timing for the jetting cycle. And then a follower robot, the one shown in red here, which lags by some T offset, which we also indicate by phase phi. And so a phase of 0 degrees means that the robots are jetting exactly in sync. And then 90 degrees means that they're a quarter of a cycle off from each other. And 180 degrees means they're jetting exactly out of phase. And so now we can take the system and then we can put it in a tank and see what is the result on the swimming performance. What you're seeing here is side-by-side comparisons of these two robot systems swimming. And what you should notice is that there are differences in speed. So some of them are swimming faster than others. There are differences in turning. So some of them are a little bit better at swimming straight than others. And there are also some systems that are oscillating more or less than others. We've done this experiment over multiple trials and extracted average performance metrics. And so what we find is that when the the steady state velocity, power consumption, and cost of transport all depend on the phase offset for these two robot systems. I think these two over here, velocity and cost of transport, have to do with the interaction between the robot and fluid, so that kind of makes sense. But what I found really surprising is that the power consumption, this is electrical power consumption from the motors in the robot, also changes as a result of this phase offset, which means that actually whatever is happening between the robots and the flow is is increasing or decreasing the amount of power and force that the motor on board needs to generate to be able to create this sort of locomotion. And so if we look at the data that's being generated from these systems, you see all the trajectories that we were able to achieve. They're kind of, this robot was just running open loop. And so we didn't really have any particular trajectory that they needed to follow. So this is just them executing their normal jetting cycle. But the one in the middle is the one that's really interesting. This is the velocity of the system over time. What we see is that the system that's jetting in sync has higher amplitude oscillations in the velocity, whereas the system that is jetting where the two robots are jetting exactly out of phase has higher frequency, lower amplitude oscillations in velocity. And this was the main observation made by biologists as well, where they actually hypothesized that the reason why most Salp colonies do not jet synchronously is that when you have these large amplitudes in velocity, you actually have higher drag on average, because drag goes as velocity squared. And so therefore, the ideal for the system is to have a very smooth velocity profile, which lowers your overall drag for the system. And so when we're able to get robots to jet out of phase with each other, we lower the variation in velocity, which has an impact on the performance of the system. Now, of course, this is not the only system that we can test. We can also now start to take a look at the physical arrangements of the system. And so what I just showed you previously was these robots aligned with each other, this arrangement right here, where we have the leader and the follower exactly next to each other. But we can start to think about other arrangements similar to what we see in Salp colonies, which is that we can put these robots a little bit offset. And what happens when we do that? Well, actually what happens is that the performance changes, but also the control timing that gives you the best performance also changes. So when we have the aligned system, we have that the lowest cost of transport and highest velocities occur when the robots are exactly out of phase. When we have robots that are offset by half of a body length, then the best performance comes when you have the robots that are jetting 270 degrees or minus 90 degrees out of phase, which means that actually the follower robot is jetting first, all right, in the gate cycle. And this is something that we found on the robotic systems. Talking with Kelly, they haven't really taken a look at in the Salp colonies at all, because they just are looking at, are the units synchronized or not synchronized? It's difficult in biological systems to really tease out the effects of morphology on these different units. And so we wanted to investigate this sort of idea further, and looped in one of the fluid dynamicists in our department who said, well, let's take a look at what the fluid flow looks like. And so these, I think, are our most interesting results from this project. So we took the robot, we put it in a particle image velocimetry system. This is basically a large tank where you drop in a whole bunch of neutrally buoyant, very small particles, and then you illuminate the particles with a laser. When you do that, then basically, when you take a video of the system, you can see the movement of the neutrally buoyant particles as they follow the fluid flow. And so what you're seeing on the right now is just our preliminary setup where we statically mounted a robot to the side of the tank here now. So it's not swimming anymore, it's just statically mounted. And as it's contracting and then creating this jet, you can see the jet and the vortices that it's creating in the flow behind it. So what we think is happening is that as the robots are jetting, these vortices are interacting with each other. And that is actually what is creating the change in performance for the robotic system. So what you're seeing now is our latest experiments on the two robot system, the aligned system. We have two robots right next to each other. On the top video over here is what happens when the robots are jetting in phase with each other. And what you see is also some very similar to what you see in the single robot system. You see the jet being emitted and traveling to the right. You see these two circulating fields being coming off of the jet. But what you also see is that the top robot and the bottom robot, because they're jetting at the same time, have a lot of interaction right here at the midline, where these two, where the vortices are now interfering with each other and creating a different flow pattern. This causes energetic waste, and then also and basically affects the pressure on the robot, which allows it to be able to swim forward. In contrast, when you have this exactly out of phase system, then you have jets that are basically exiting the measurement area before the next jet is generated. And so you have very little interaction between these vortices. That is what is we think allowing them to be able to get much more efficient locomotion. I'm not showing here the measurements from the 90-degree out of phase experiment, but basically it's somewhere between the middle of the two, where you see small amounts of interaction between these jets. At the same time, so if this is the reason for more energy efficient locomotion, it would make sense now that when you have a physically offset system, that the ideal control input would change. And so what you're seeing now is on the top, the aligned system, and on the bottom, the one where the two robots are about half body offset from each other, where actually what we found serendipitously is that the speed of the jet is about half a robot body length per second, which means that and the robots have a gait cycle of about 4 seconds. And so each second of delay in the gait cycle corresponds to the one half a body length of movement in the robot's emitted jet. And so 90 degrees here is basically half a body length in terms of physical shifting. And so what we're seeing is that in terms of the flow for the system, not the physical arrangement of the robot, but in terms of flow, having the robots exactly out of phase with each other in the aligned system is pretty much equivalent to having them 270 degrees out of phase for the offset system. And that is why we're seeing that these similar trends in cost of transport and achievable velocity. Not only that, but I want to note that actually the performance metrics also change between the different arrangements. So what we see is that for the best performing robot in the aligned case versus the offset case, that actually the velocity is higher and the cost of transport is lower when we have the two robots offset from each other. And the reason for this, we believe, is that because the robot is a little bit longer, when the robots are jetting out of phase, they're creating the same torque on the system, but the resulting oscillations are smaller. And as a result, you have less wasted effort in the offset system. This is really interesting when we then compare this back to the biological systems, because what we see in Salp chains is not just these chains that I showed you at the beginning, but actually a wide variety of different morphologies for these systems. So the ones that I showed you at the beginning were these kind of linear chain systems, which correspond to the half body offsets that I showed you in our robotic system. But there's a huge diversity of different arrangements from these transversal systems. This is the aligned system that we tested, these clusters and these world systems, where some of these just really look very random. And when you look at the biological data, then these different morphologies do show trends in some of them being more efficient swimmers and some of them being less efficient swimmers than others. And so what we're interested in looking at now is, well, how if we also then take a look at how these swimmers are controlling themselves, does that also show correlation with the results that we've seen on the robotic system? One thing I want to bring up on this plot here is that there's this weird morphology here, which is the cluster morphology, which is this one. which compared to all the others is in this high speed range, low cost of transport range, despite not having a very streamlined arrangement, which is what we might normally try to design in a robotic system. This cluster arrangement just basically has all of the Salps very far apart. And if we then compare this to the results that we just saw previously, it may have to do with just being able to physically separate the units so that they just have very little interaction with each other. So one other thing I want to bring up is that these systems are highly nonlinear. And so you may have seen in our system, we have basically an aperture in the back, which we're using to suck in and expel this jet, compared to Salps, which have an aperture in the front and an aperture in the back that they used to have a more streamlined flow. And so one of the things that we're trying to do in addition to these multi-robot systems is try to see whether we can improve the individual robot itself. Another interesting connection that we've made with people completely outside of engineering is that we showed this robot to a cardiologist at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and he noticed that actually these kinds of tubular pumps are very similar to embryonic hearts. So embryonic hearts are not these like human embryonic hearts are not these 4-chamber hearts that adults have. They're really just tubes. And they work off of this principle known as the Liebau phenomenon, which was discovered by a German cardiologist in the 1950s, where actually you don't need valves at all. And what you in fact need is just this oscillation of the tube and some very precise mechanical design that has a combination of both soft tubing and rigid tubing. I'm going to show you a slowed down video of someone that we took in the lab, where we basically just took this electromagnetic pincher and then pinched this soft tube. And we were seeing is basically when you have this soft tube, you get a traveling wave of this pinching motion down the tube. When you have rigid walls on the two sides, then you can get reflections of this wave that, because of the asymmetry of pinching, allow you to generate flow. Now, this is much now more similar to what we see in biological Salps and something that we're trying to integrate into our swimmer robot. And what I think is really fascinating about this is, unlike peristaltic robots where we see a lot of actuators throughout the whole robot body, this one only needs one. Not only does it only need one, but actually when you change the frequency of activation, you can manipulate the flow and you can get it to be either in the positive direction, whatever you mean by positive, or in the opposite direction. And this change in flow does not require any valving. It doesn't require any change in actuator position. It just requires you to know something about the mechanics of the structure and the interaction between the structure and the fluid. Of course, this interaction is very nonlinear, so it's difficult to design, but it is possible. And so this is our newest version of our underwater robot. Still working on waterproofing and integrating everything, but you can see it's basically this tube. We have this pinching actuator on the side. When you change the frequency of that pinching actuator, you can get the robot to transition from moving forwards to moving backwards. All of this without having only one actuator and then manipulating this frequency. And so we're really excited through the course of this project to learn more about underwater swimming, about soft robotics, about multi-robot systems and collectives of soft robots, and how we can manipulate their designs, how we can design them to be able to change robot fluid interactions. And so looking forward, we have this long-term vision, which is that we want to create soft robotic networks that allow us to do exploration and sensing in the ocean. Now, in order to do that, we need to be able to transition between being able to create these widespread networks for, which means having robots that can move in solitary mode. But then if we want to be able to take these systems and move them long distances to other locations for sensing of other things, then we can take advantage of their ability to coordinate with each other and physically connect to be able to travel those long distances. Within each of these different modes, there are a lot of really interesting questions that we want to explore, really all having to do with this idea of taking advantage of interactions between the robot and the environment. For the individual robot, there is this question of what are effective mechanisms that we can use to improve power efficiency? Like, is the Liebau effect actually something that we can use for swimming? How do we optimize the robot mechanics to be able to take advantage of those mechanisms effectively? And really how many actuators and where should they be placed on these sorts of robots to be able to get agile locomotion. The robot that I showed you today can only move forward and backwards. We haven't done any steering yet, but that's something that we're trying to investigate this summer. And when it comes to getting these robots to move in full 3D, how much additional actuation do we need to add to the system versus how much of it is really just changing the controller. When it comes to looking at collectives of soft robots, I think they're even more interesting questions, which have to do with robot environment, robot interactions, which are how does the way that we physically arrange these systems and connect them to each other affect their potential for agility, maneuverability, efficiency? Because that sort of physical arrangement is very much coupled with the controllers that are going to produce this sort of performance in the system. And what is that coupling? And finally, the last thing I want to bring up is when we have these multi-robot systems, there are also really interesting questions that have to do with sensing and communication. If you look at the multi-robot literature, a lot of it assumes that you have wired communication, active communication, actively telling each other what your pose or your decisions are in order to reach consensus. But when you're in these sorts of environments where your robots are actually affecting the fluid flow and you have another robot next to you that can sense the fluid flow, communication does not need to be active. You can communicate through pressure waves in the environment, and robots can figure out what other robots are doing to be able to time their jets accordingly, potentially without active communication at all. So this is our agenda for the next few years, where I think over the course of the last few years, we've learned a lot about soft robot design. We've learned a lot about multi-robot systems, and also a lot about fluid dynamics, which I never thought I would have to do when I started in robotics, but really opening up a lot of interesting questions in this space. So before I close, I want to thank the people who've worked on these projects, of course, the students who did all of the work. So Annie Yang is the PhD student who is leading our Salp project. Gabe is the one who's looking at the Liebau mechanism, and Dongsheng is looking at fluid dynamics models, as well as help from a lot of undergraduates and master students, and of course, our amazing collaborators. And with that, I'm happy to also answer any questions.
I can ask a question, right? Can you hear it?
I can't really hear you, so if you could get closer to the mic, that would be helpful.
Okay, maybe no. Maybe. Is this better?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. I have two questions. First one is, when you start going from robots to robot colonies, do you think you would need another definition for cost of transport, or would the one that is being used is going to be applicable still?
Sure. We're using the same one right now. So the definition we're using for cost of transport is electrical energy consumption over the weight of the robot times its average displacement. So over like one gate cycle. So there's also a lot of oscillation in the system, so we're not doing instantaneous displacement. I think this is the same cost of transport that we use for the single robot and for the colonies. And we are planning to use the same cost of transport metric. If you look at the biological systems, their cost of transport is the same energy over weight times distance, but now energy is measured by oxygen consumption. But again, you can use the same metric between the solitary salps and the salp colonies.
I was just confused because when you showed the colonies of the salps, you said some of them are not even contributing to jetting.
Yes.
And then it gives me the intuition that, oh, that's not going to be good for the cost of transport, I guess, of the system.
Yeah, it's really... Oh, go ahead.
No, go. Yeah, that was the point, actually. Like,
No,
how would you go with that? Yeah.
Yeah, I love that comment because, okay, this is a conversation I had with the fish people, so this is not the first time anybody has looked at multi-robot systems underwater, right? But a lot of times when people look at multi-robot systems underwater, they're looking at fish and schools of fish. And schools of fish are disconnected systems, right? And so what they've found in that literature is that there's a very similar effect where when you control the fish with the right timing, you can also change the fluid flow and make sure that the oscillation of the fish is in line with vortices being shed from the one in front of it, so that you can get better energy efficiency. However, in those fish systems, what they've seen is that really the energy savings that they're able to get is only something like 14 to 20%, which in our system was the same, right? So in our robotic system, the 2 robot system improved its cost of transport by about 14% compared to the other one. And so, but when you look at the biological literature and they measure cost of transport for these long chains versus these single robots, what they see is that the cost of transport decreases by like almost 6 times. And I think that that's because a lot of the units are not active. Now, I guess when you look at the cost of transport formula, there are multiple effects, right? One is that you add mass for units that are not doing anything. But also because of the way that the colony, so you would think that the cost of transport, well, so that might either lower the cost of transport because your mass has gone up, so your denominator has gone up, or it might increase the cost of transport because your acceleration has gone down, right? Because now you're the same amount of force, the system is moving slower. But when you have these streamlined systems now, and the units that are inactive are placed either randomly throughout the structure, or maybe they're on the interior of the structure, then the way that the flow is flowing around the system makes the loss in acceleration less. So I think, yes, so there are really interesting questions of like what happens when some of the units are inactive. Whether cost of transport is the right metric is probably something we should think about. But I think the effect of inactive units on the controller and where those inactive units should go is also a really fascinating design question. Sorry, that was a really long-winded response to your question.
No, thank you. Yeah, nice. Anyone else? Yes, maybe you need to also, yeah, maybe you should come.
Okay, sure. Thank you very much for the talk. I was just wondering, how do these propulsion techniques that you've shown, do they compare to some of the more traditional approaches, I guess, with impellers and screws? And do you also get beneficial effects there if you stack robots in I guess, certain arrangements in multi-robot systems?
Yes, so we did not directly compare to impeller. So the way that we've been looking at this project is more as like a bio-inspired project. So we compared to like fish, and jet propelled swimmers are less efficient than these sort of oscillating wave swimmers. We did not compare to impellers, although that would be an interesting comparison. From my understanding, though, from not impellers, but propellers literature, is that you do see a similar effect where when you bring them very close to each other, you have interactions between them, and if you arrange them in the wrong way, then those interactions cause inefficiencies, and when you arrange them in the right way, then you can see these gains in efficiency.
Interesting. Okay, thank you so much.
Anyone has a question? Oh, Mike has a question.
Hi, it was a wonderful talk. I enjoyed it a lot. I had a quick question on the experimental design of the Salps. So you tried a lot of the offset angles and also for the different geometries, but it was very discrete. I assume you manually changed designs and tested it then for, is there any approach in simulation that you tried to find like more optimal angles and setups of maybe even more than 2 jets?
Yeah, so I didn't talk about our simulation approaches today. We are using the water lily simulator to look at the interaction between the robot skin and the fluid. We have at this point been able to simulate the one robot system. And what we're trying to do, and the reason why we did PIV experiments, is we want to tune the parameters for the simulation to make sure that it actually matches the experiments before we start to really scale up in the simulation. So we're doing that matching right now. And then what we want to do with the simulator is answer that exact question. So if we change, can we change the arrangements? I showed the translational offset, but you can also think about changing the angles between units. And that would be a much easier way to do this exploration than having to set up all these experiments.
Absolutely. No, that sounds wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I guess there is a question in chat.
Oh. Okay, the question says, what kinds of collaborative jetting patterns can maximize the swimming speed of Salp-Inspired robots? And how might these patterns generalize as the number of robots increase between the phase shift of jetting, group morphology, and collective force interaction with the fluid? Which do you think plays the most critical role in propulsion efficiency? Yes, so as you know, we only tested on 2 robots so far, and the scaling up is a problem we will have to deal with, hopefully through simulation, but we will also verify through experiments. And I think there are a lot of sub-questions here. So really, the research space is wide open. One of them has to do with the first point that you brought up, which is, what kinds of collaborative jetting patterns are needed and how do they change as the number of robots increase. One thing I showed during the slide was this comparison of swimming between the different phases for the robot system, and you saw these oscillations in velocity, right? This is because for a 2-robot system, when you're creating these pulse jets and the timing between the jets is large enough, then the system will periodically accelerate and decelerate. When you have more robots and you can space the jets more closely together in terms of timing, then you can start to smooth out these velocity profiles. And what we see in like Salp colonies is that the velocities the curves are pretty much flat, because basically you have units along the entire chain that are jetting pretty much all the time. And so we think that these patterns will only become more apparent when you have more units. And this is also in line with these models that like Kelly's group has created, where you also start to see more magnified effects, even with very similar control strategies. Now, for the second question about between physical arrangement, controllers, and fluid interaction, which is the more important, honestly, they're all coupled, right? And so like when you change the physical arrangement of the system, now you change the way that the fluid interacts with the colony. When you change the control, now you change the timing of forces and therefore the physical arrangements of these vortices. And then the fluid interaction is what is coupling the two. And so based on the preliminary results, which I showed today, our hypothesis is that for the most propulsion efficiency, what you want to do is minimize interaction between jets. And what that means potentially is that when you have whatever physical arrangement you have, the robots that are really, really close to each other, maybe those are the ones that some of them are the ones you choose to be inactive so that they never interfere with their neighbors at all. And the ones that are farther away are the ones that can jet simultaneously. And so nobody has done this study on the Salp colonies yet, but I think it would be really fascinating to look at videos of these Salp colonies and say, well, they're jetting randomly, but is this random both in space and in time? And now when we look at correlations between the randomness in space and the randomness in time, is that not actually random? And I think that will tell us something about propulsion efficiency, taking this fluid interaction into account.
Anyone in the room? No? Can I maybe ask another question then?
Sure.
This is probably further away in the future. Oh, there's another question. Maybe you can go with that first. I already asked.
What are the difficulties in steering the jet robot, and how long can it operate right now? Right now, it can operate for 3 hours. And then in terms of steering, basically right now we just have the single actuator that contracts and releases the robot. The steering, I think there are mechanisms that exist for us to do that. And so one of them is thrust vectoring. You can change, you can, aim the body so that it compresses more on one side than the other. And now when you release, the jet is in a particular direction. So I think You can add fins, right? Other people have done it. So these are all things that other people have tried. And so we're going to basically look through the literature and see what is the most convenient thing to put in our system. In terms of 3D steering, I think that's going to be a little bit more difficult for us because we'll need to figure out buoyancy control and how we're going to pack all of that into the robot. And that just becomes a complex design challenge because of the volume constraints. But the steering is fairly well studied, so I'm optimistic that we can take care of it.
Okay. I was going to ask, instead of just mechanically assembling all these units, are you looking into other like self-assembly methods, reconfigurability, and all those aspects?
Yes. So I think, but we want to take this project one step at a time, because when you start talking about systems that can self-assemble, the natural question is, what should they self-assemble into, right? And so how we're starting is basically, given a physical arrangement, what can we say about its capabilities? And that then, once we have that information, now we can try to solve the inverse problem, which is, given a certain task, what is the arrangement and the control strategy that would be good for it? And now you have a goal for a self-assembling system. In terms of the mechanical design, of course, like mechanisms for attaching and detaching are also going to be a challenge underwater. And so it's kind of like on the back burner right now. We haven't thought too much about it. But I think then the really fascinating intermediate question becomes, let's say you have this physical attachment mechanism and you know what assembly you want to create, but somehow you need to get these two robots that are far apart from each other, close enough to each other, and in the right relative positions to be able to attach in a fluid flow. And this is then why we've been talking to the fish people, because we want to figure out how to get that to happen.
Yeah, that will be very interesting to see. Like, yeah. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. I think we do not have more questions. So once again, thank you very much, Cynthia, for joining us today and explaining this super hot and super interesting topic to us. Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much for coming.